The Doom of the Haunted Opera by Brad Strickland and John Bellairs, Chapter 13. When Rosarita gasped out the story of what had happened at the theater, Mrs. Jaeger looked as if she were going to faint. "Oh, dear," she muttered. "This is terrible." "What can we do?" asked Rosarita. They were sitting in Mrs. Jaeger's kitchen, drinking mugs of hot cocoa. It was 11 o'clock on a dark night with no moon but lots of stars. It was well past her bedtime, but Rosarita was afraid to go home. Afraid because her mother, under the evil spell of that dreadful man, might accidentally lead Mr. Vanderhelm to her. The wicked musician surely recognized that Rosarita had been the other person in the theater with Louis, and heaven knew what he would do if he got his hands on her. Heaven knew what he might already have done to Louis, for that matter. "Help me think, Mrs. Jaeger. We've got to do something," pleaded Rosarita. "Of course we do," replied Mrs. Jaeger with a nervous frown. "Let me see. First, we can call the police, because we know some of the policemen are actually in that opera. First, we can't call the police, because we know some of the policemen are actually in that opera and under Vanderhelm's spell. Second, we can't go to the theater tonight, because Mr. Vanderhelm, or whoever that horror is, would be on his guard. It's almost the witching hour, too, when evil things are strongest, and you already know how weak I am at magic. Well, since Mr. Vanderhelm never detected my presence, I suppose we're safe enough here. At least he hasn't tried to make me and my house vanish. And my feeling is that he simply doesn't know about me. However, it won't do to just sit here and be idle. I know what I wish we could do." Rosarita grunted in irritation. She was used to Mrs. Zimmerman, who made up her mind quickly and acted right away. Mrs. Jaeger's methodical plotting irritated Rosarita, who preferred quick action. "What is that?" she asked. Mrs. Jaeger gave her an apologetic smile. "Well, I wish we could go to Jonathan Bonnevelt's house. You see, since Vanderhelm did not cast his spell over Jonathan's house, he will be unable to touch it." "Why?" asked Rosarita. By now she had talked with Mrs. Jaeger enough to know that while the old woman could perform very little magic, she knew a great deal about the subject. Mrs. Jaeger took a moment or two to consider before she responded. "It's complicated, but think of a magic spell as a work of art. Like, a sculpture that is carved from stone. Once the sculpture is complete, it is complete. You can't take any more stone away without spoiling what you have. A spell is the same way. It is carved, so to speak, from the magic that exists inside and around the magician. Once it is complete, it can't be changed, except to be removed entirely. So, if Vanderhelm tried to cast a spell to make Jonathan Bonnevelt's house vanish, he might succeed, but then the houses of all the other magicians in New Zebedee would appear. Unless he did something very foolish, the magicians would return with their houses. I don't think Mr. Vanderhelm would care to face them." "So we would be safe in Louis's house?" asked Rosarita. Mrs. Jaeger looked worried. "I'm not sure if we'd be safe any place, but I would feel better there than anywhere else, and there is always the possibility that the mirror in the hall could let us communicate with Jonathan of Florence. We'd have to be there for the spell to work, though." "I forgot about the mirror," confessed Rosarita. She wondered whether she should tell Mrs. Jaeger about the magic mirror that Mrs. Zimmerman had once owned, the one that caused Mrs. Zimmerman and Rosarita to travel to the past and face a terrible sorcerer. But the story seemed too long to tell, so Rosarita merely said, "Well, if Mrs. Holtz leaves early tomorrow, we should get in then. Louis told me that she always locks the door, but I know where his uncle hides a spare key. What can we do tonight?" "Get some sleep," replied Mrs. Jaeger. "We won't be any good to Louis or anyone else if we worry ourselves sick. You may stay in the guest room tonight. One of my granddaughter's nightgowns will fit you, I think." So Rosarita went to bed unwittingly in Mrs. Jaeger's house, worrying about Louis and wondering if anything they could do would stop the ghastly creature that called itself Vanderhelm. As for Louis, he had finally recovered control of himself. He had been terrified out of his wits for more than an hour. It was horrible to be locked in the dark with a skeleton, but there was nothing he could do to get away. Finally, he calmed down a little. If only there were a gleam of light, he thought. It wouldn't be so bad. Just a thin beam, a candle's flame, would make him feel better. But he had no way of making a light. So, standing in the dark, leaning against the rough brick wall, he tried to come up with something else. An idea occurred to him, a terrible idea in a way, but it was all he could summon up. He tried 2 or 3 times to call a name out loud, but he lost his nerve each time. Finally, balling his trembling hands into fists and squeezing his eyes tightly shut, Lewis managed to squeak out a plaintive, "Mr. Finster?" No answer. Lewis panted. His lungs wheezed as if there was no air in the little cubicle, but he could feel a faint breeze in the corner, where air came in through the round holes in some of the bricks. What felt like suffocation was simply fear. He gathered all his nerve and said, "I call on the ghost of Mordecai Finster. I call upon it in the name of all that is good." The temperature in the room suddenly dropped 10 degrees. An icy chill ran down Lewis's spine. Someone was with him now, someone or something. His hair bristled and goosebumps crinkled the skin of his arms. "Stop him," wailed a low, soft voice, sounding lonely and tormented. "I'm trying to," gasped Lewis. "Only Mr. Vanderhelm isn't real. He's made up of sheet music." "It is a phantasm," the voice replied, its tone still eerie enough to freeze Lewis's blood. "The living Vanderhelm created a ghostly double of himself by a vile magical spell. In life I hid the enchanted music away, but you found it, and thereby released the evil double of Vanderhelm upon the world. Now it will try to do its dead master's will and become the king of the dead. Stop him, oh stop him." "Could you not talk like that?" asked Lewis. "It's scaring me." "Oh, sorry," said the voice in more companionable tones. "Didn't mean to get on your nerves. One gets used to being a ghost, you know. My spirit has haunted this wretched theater ever since I died of cruel thirst and slow starvation after Vanderhelm locked me away in this dark hole." Lewis found he could breathe again. Mr. Finster's voice had completely changed. Now he sounded a bit absent-minded, but friendly and encouraging. It helped a little. "Why did you haunt the theater?" Lewis asked. "To keep anyone from releasing the spell, of course," answered the voice. "Only you found it so quickly. I hadn't materialized in so long I was a bit rusty. It took me too much time to become solid enough to be visible to mortal eyes or to make myself heard. I tried to warn you." "I'm sorry," said Lewis. "Oh, well, it couldn't be helped." The voice took on a melancholy tone. "I was hoping you could somehow destroy the music and the spell, you see. Then I would be free at last." Lewis blinked in the darkness. "I don't understand." "I am bound to earth by my determination to help rid the world of Vanderhelm's foul enchantments," explained the voice. "If the spell is broken, then I may depart. If the charm is fulfilled, however," the voice dropped to a low, frightening whisper, "if it is fulfilled, then I will rise up and be enslaved by Vanderhelm's cursed will. I hope that does not happen, boy, for your sake." "You wouldn't hurt me," squeaked Lewis. "Of course not," said the voice. "But when the opera is sung through, Vanderhelm's spell will be complete, and the dead will arise to do his bidding, and once that happens, the ban will be lifted." "What ban?" asked Lewis. "The ban against spilling blood," returned the voice. "That's why the original Vanderhelm did not kill me outright. To do so would have ruined his chances of completing his horrible spell. You see, I stole the dreadful music score from his dressing room and was hurrying out with it when I heard Vanderhelm coming up the stairs. I remembered he was planning to replace the piano in the orchestra pit, so I thrust the music inside the old one, hoping it would be carried out the very next day. Unfortunately, Vanderhelm caught me and could tell I was up to something. He tried to make me talk, but I refused. Finally, he threw me in this dismal hole, and early the next morning my friend Lucius Mickleberry sealed Vanderhelm's fate. But alas, I was never found, never found. What can—" Lewis started to shake again. "What can I do?" he asked with a groan. "Use whatever you can," returned the ghost. "Use whatever I leave you." "My time grows short. Farewell, Louis Barnevelt. Who knocks may enter or leave." The darkness grew a little warmer. Lewis called out Mr. Finster's name once or twice, but no one answered. Dazed and utterly confused by the ghost's parting words, Lewis huddled in a corner, as far away from the pile of bones as possible. Sheer exhaustion overtook him, and at last he slept. And that's the end of chapter 13.